morning when Jake Hemmert accepted a plea deal. He'll spend 30 years in prison for murdering his father.
In a quiet neighborhood in Alva, Florida, a seemingly ordinary wellness check spirals into a dark and twisted tale of deceit, betrayal, and murder. Brian Hemmert, a beloved father and Navy veteran, vanishes without a trace. His son, Jake Hemmert, tells a story riddled with inconsistencies, raising suspicion among family and law enforcement alike. What starts as concern for a missing father soon becomes a shocking investigation that unveils a disturbing crime committed by someone closest to him. This is the harrowing story of how lies, desperation, and betrayal ended in tragedy, leaving a family shattered forever. Paul Hemmert, a retired man in his late 70s, had always maintained a close relationship with his son Brian. Their weekly phone calls were a cherished routine, keeping them connected despite living in different states. When weeks passed without hearing from Brian, Paul's concern grew into fear. His instincts told him something was wrong. Paul had initially tried to reach Jake, his grandson, who was living with Brian at the time. Jake claimed that Brian was recovering from a severe car accident and needed time to rest. Despite Jake's assurances, Paul couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Brian was known for his resilience and communication. Even during tough times, he would keep in touch. Unable to get a straight answer, Paul finally contacted the Lee County Sheriff's Office, explaining the situation and requesting a welfare check. He provided all the details he could, including Jake's inconsistent stories and Brian's last known condition.
What happened the last time you spoke to him over 10 weeks ago?
Well, we had normal communication, and then it just quit. And his son's there with him part of the time. He works on does computer work and is out of town. But I'm not going to say anything more than that at this time. But I'm just I have had no communication other than a couple of statements from him that had been in an auto wreck and was injured and was in the hospital. He said would be there for a couple of weeks and then would come home.
Okay, when was that car accident?
It was about 10 weeks. I don't have the exact date.
Officers were dispatched to the scene, prepared for what they assumed would be a routine check. However, what they found was far from ordinary. Jake Hemmert, Brian's son, was known to law enforcement. He had a troubled past and was rumored to associate with local biker gangs. When officers finally made contact with Jake, his story quickly began to unravel. Jake initially claimed that his father was recovering from a car accident and was housebound due to injuries. However, when pressed for details, his account became increasingly erratic. At one point, he mentioned that Brian had gone on a hunting trip in Idaho, contradicting his earlier statement. Suspicion grew as investigators noted Jake's nervous demeanor and inconsistent responses. What started as a simple welfare check was now turning into a full-fledged investigation. Officers decided to search the property for any signs of foul play. As officers entered the property, the silence was deafening. There were no signs of movement, no lights on, and no one answered the repeated knocks at the door. Neighbors reported that they hadn't seen Brian in weeks, but they occasionally spotted Jake coming and going at odd hours. The officers decided to search the premises. It was during this search that they came across the garage freezer, a common household appliance that held an unthinkable secret. As they opened the freezer, they were met with a gruesome sight: the lifeless body of Brian Hemmert, wrapped in plastic and hidden beneath layers of frozen goods. The scene was immediately secured, and forensic teams were called in to document the evidence. The discovery marked the beginning of a homicide investigation, and Jake Hemmert quickly became the prime suspect. Detectives knew they had a complex case on their hands, one involving lies, financial motives, and a potential cover-up by a family member. As detectives dug deeper into Jake Hemmert's life, they uncovered a troubling financial history. Bank records showed that in the weeks following Brian's disappearance, Jake had withdrawn over $30,000 from his father's account. This raised a critical question. Was financial greed the primary motive behind the murder? Further investigation revealed that Jake had a history of financial instability and legal troubles. Friends and acquaintances described him as someone who struggled to hold down a job and often relied on his father for financial support. Despite Brian's attempts to help his son get back on his feet, Jake seemed to spiral further into debt and desperation. Detectives theorized that Jake's mounting financial pressures may have driven him to an unthinkable decision: to murder his own father in order to gain control of his finances. It was a chilling hypothesis, but the evidence increasingly supported it. Jake's inconsistent stories, the financial transactions, and his erratic behavior painted a damning picture of a man willing to do anything for money. The story of Brian Hemmert's murder and the subsequent trial of his son, Jake, gripped the nation. Media outlets across the country covered the case extensively, with headlines highlighting the betrayal at the heart of the crime. The shocking revelation that a son could murder his own father for financial gain sparked widespread outrage and disbelief. Public reaction was swift, with many expressing sympathy for Paul Hemmert, who had not only lost his son but was also dealing with the betrayal of his grandson. Social media platforms became inundated with discussions about the case, with users debating the possible motives behind Jake's actions and questioning how someone could commit such a heinous crime against a family member. Some commentators pointed out the importance of mental health awareness, suggesting that Jake's troubled past and erratic behavior might have been warning signs of deeper psychological issues. Others argued that no amount of psychological distress could justify such an act of betrayal and greed. Experts who analyzed the case suggested that Jake's behavior might have been driven by a combination of financial desperation and underlying psychological issues. Jake's erratic actions, inconsistent stories, and inability to maintain stable relationships pointed to possible personality disorders. According to forensic psychologists, individuals who commit crimes against close family members often exhibit signs of deep-seated resentment or entitlement. In Jake's case, his reliance on his father for financial support may have contributed to feelings of inadequacy and frustration, ultimately culminating in a desperate and violent act. Psychologists also noted the impact of substance abuse on Jake's decision-making. Reports indicated that Jake had struggled with addiction, which likely exacerbated his financial problems and impaired his judgment. This combination of factors created a volatile situation with tragic consequences. Jake Hemmert's trial began amid widespread media coverage. The case had captured public attention, not only due to the gruesome nature of the crime, but also because of the betrayal at its core: a son accused of murdering his father. Prosecutors wasted no time in laying out their case, presenting evidence of Jake's financial withdrawals, his inconsistent statements to police, and the chilling discovery of Brian's body. In court, Jake appeared unemotional, maintaining his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. His defense team argued that there was no direct evidence linking Jake to the murder itself, suggesting that someone else could have been responsible. They attempted to portray Jake as a troubled individual who had made poor choices but was not capable of committing such a heinous act. Despite these efforts, the jury was unconvinced. After days of deliberation, they returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty on all counts. Jake was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, remarked on the callousness of the crime and the devastating impact it had on the family. Outside the courtroom, Paul Hemmert spoke briefly to reporters. "I've lost not just my son, but my grandson as well," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "This is a tragedy that no family should ever have to endure." The story of Jake Hemmert serves as a grim reminder of how greed and deceit can destroy even the closest of family bonds. What began as a concerned father's plea for a wellness check ended in a horrifying revelation of betrayal and murder. In the world of true crime, tales like these are rare but deeply unsettling, highlighting the dark side of human nature. While justice was served, the tragedy of Brian Hemmert's untimely death will never be forgotten.